There we go. Okay. Anybody have any questions they'd like to start with? Something that occurred to them? Need to clear up or anything?
Well, Richard, may I?
Mhm.
I wonder, when did actually the stock market begin? Does Marx also talk about the stock market, or how did that start? Because that way was, I suppose, was the idea that everybody could share in the winning, or what was earned.
Let me look that up real quick. Stock market origin. Well, there has been something like stock since the 13th century, apparently.
Wow.
US, no, let's see. Established part of economic life in the 18th century. Wow, which is a little earlier than I would have thought.
Mm-hmm.
So it was in the 1700s, really. Not being an economist, that's not the part of Marx that I focus on, so I don't actually know the answer to that question. I would guess that somewhere in Capital he's got to be talking about stock markets, because if they're that old, then they had to be around and be an issue. But it's interesting. I don't, even just thinking about when I hear people talk about economic history, I can't even recall things where people have talked about histories of stock markets. That's a really good question.
Really good.
Don't know.
Yeah.
Well, wasn't it always about the public ownership of everything? And so that naturally leads to, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest idea is probably about limited liability corporations. And so when you get a legal structure to create that entity that's going to have all of the risk instead of the person having the risk, now you could sell.
Right.
It becomes more interesting to people to buy shares, because now they're not at risk. Their shares aren't really at risk because they're insulated from the corporation.
The big problem is though, Richard, that we don't know how these stocks are made, how they are earned. I mean, I have CDs, but I don't know who's earning that money for me. Maybe that are child labor. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, it would depend on the companies that fund is invested in.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Yeah, and sometimes you can have, that's easy information to get, and I think other times, it's a little more opaque.
I know I'm not investing in any military stuff. You can do that.
Right. You can find funds that are specifically organized to be responsible in some way or another.
Wasn't it? Go ahead.
Sorry.
I was going to say, wasn't it around the time of South African independence that divestiture became like a huge thing for like educational institutions and pension funds and things like that?
No.
Oh yeah, in the late 80s with the challenge to apartheid in South Africa. This idea of not being invested in those corporations.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but see, big investors can pick and choose a lot more than small investors can pick and choose. Yeah, so it's more direct for a big investor. And it makes more difference, if investors are selling off, that becomes significant.
I have a question.
Yeah, because no, go ahead.
Well, my question is not about the stock market. So,
well, I just wanted to add that it's municipalities and large institutions that can hold stock that can have a sway.
Yeah, enough stock to have a sway. Yeah. Okay, Nina.
New topic. This is just a little thing. When I was in college, which was a very, very long time ago, and I majored in biology, teleological meant, the giraffes grow their necks longer because they can reach the leaves of the pulling. But then last week you said that was teleomony.
Mhm.
So is that where did that change in vocabulary?
I'm not sure. I mean, just as a matter of definition, the way that the people you're talking about talked was just wrong.
Oh, yeah. And you'd
So
say,
it's
in fact,
not,
oh, that's teleological. That's a teleological argument.
yeah. So I think they might, I mean, it would more mean looked teleological, that the giraffe's neck looks like it has this purpose. It was designed for a purpose. So it's probably, I mean, I'm not sure when that language came about. I mean, I only encountered it probably in the 90s.
Yeah,
About
I was in
teleonomy.
college a lot, long.
Yeah. So I mean, and I'm probably outside of philosophy, you might, you know, people are going to use some of those words a little more loosely too. So it's
I just
possible
heard
that
of
either,
teleonomy.
yeah. So that I think is just an attempt to get more precise, because there's a point at which, you know, there's a thing called philosophy of science where, you know, philosophers are looking at how does science work and how does it organize itself, and eventually you get sub-disciplines in that. So there's a philosophy of biology and a philosophy of chemistry, and certainly by the time there's people doing something that's explicitly a philosophy of biology, they're gonna be pushing back on teleological language to say, wait a second, no, that's that's the word you're using the word wrong. You need a different word. Here's a different word. So it might be that, yeah, it might be that it just took a little time for my field to kind of catch up and with figure out the proper language that biologists should be using.
Right.
That's my
And
guess.
teleology has then to do with the philosophical idea that something is pulling civilization or whatever.
Well, just that there's an end goal. It's because it's actually part of, Aristotle talks about it. So
Right.
biologists actually would have originally picked this up from Aristotle because he did write stuff that on nature that really is properly called biology, and he believed everything had a natural telos to it.
Mhm.
And so nature in his version, it's sort of nature is the force that's drawing it, but there's something drawing everything
it,
towards its
right.
own natural end. Or he often would even talk like the end was its own force drawing the thing to it somehow, that depending on what he was talking about.
But
So yeah, so that's there in the history.
but evolution
Just
sort
brought
of
it back.
counters that
Yeah.
that
Exactly.
approach.
Yeah. Evolution comes along and says, no, that's not actually how change happens.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
It's accidental and blind.
Well, they were saying that back when I was in college.
Yeah. Well, of course they do that then. Yeah.
Not that dark.
Just how they explained it is the issue.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I was struck that they would call a giraffe's neck teleological.
No, it's not that they're calling the neck teleological. They're saying that the reason that giraffes have longer necks is that they needed to reach up into higher leaves. And so that's how the giraffe's neck developed length, not that the ones who had longer necks had a natural
Advantage.
Yeah, no. They never said the necks were teleological.
Yeah, and actually, now that you're saying it, I think Aristotle even used giraffes as an example.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, so he definitely would have talked that way. That the nature of the giraffe is to be driven towards long necks. Yeah.
Because the leaves are high. But the leaves are high so that the giraffes with long necks have a natural advantage.
Yeah.
That's the actual explanation.
Yeah. And just random mutations produce that. All right, then. Well, let's roll back into the talk. So we have 15 minutes or so. I don't know how long it'll take us to get through that. And then I have another one that's the whole it's a kind of a group panel discussion. It was a book launch for the book that Professor Saito did. But only about the first hour, well, even 50 minutes of that is actually, I thought, useful. The other rest of it, they got a little off the track. But so we have those two things to try to get through today. We'll see how much we can do. Okay. And actually, yeah, and this next one does a pretty good job, I think, of drilling down on some of the ideas and explaining them more. So that should be interesting. But let's finish what we were doing. Just gotta do that. What? Wait a second. Share. I'm just gonna see your screen. They don't need to see that. Okay. Are you seeing the YouTube video?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I backed it up. We stopped at 1730 something. So I backed it up just a little bit.
More creative activities or whatsoever, but this is something that has been seriously marginalized and oppressed under the capitalist model production. And in order to bring up this kind of marginalized utopia back into the table again, I think it is also necessary to redefine abundance and scarcity. And this is why the humanities is very important, because we can sort of have this new definition of these concepts, and so that we can have a more non-productive post-scarcity society. And this is also conducted recently by Benanav in his critique of full automation. But in any case, I do this by going back to Marx. And the problem is that basically under capitalism, we can never have abundance. Capitalism is a system that is ultimately essentially characterized by scarcity, because capitalism.
Now here, this might have surprised you that he says something like that, but he's going to explain what he means. But that it's actually capitalism produces scarcity, not abundance. It's ironic that way is also the point.
Capitalism aims at endless growth, endless capital accumulation. So it is really, no matter how much it develops, it is always scarce. And capital also creates scarcity through commodification of the entire world. And this is what John Bellamy Foster problematizes as paradox of wealth, or the Lauderdale paradox. It's about how the increase of private wealth is fundamentally characterized by the decline or decrease of public wealth. Because if we remember about the primitive accumulation, it's about dissolving the commons in order to create the private wealth. So from the beginning, from the very beginning, capitalism characterized by this creation of artificial scarcity. That's the
so in the late Middle Ages, there are large tracts of land that were sort of basically open, and they may have technically been owned by a monarch or somebody like that, but they're open to people, and so they're called the commons, and ordinary people could just wander through the forest and pick mushrooms and berries and hunt and cut trees for wood, and so there's this natural abundance that's part of their lives. And that won't work for capitalism. So there's this process that's called enclosure of the commons, and little by little, those commons are sold off into different parcels that are privatized, and then the more they're privatized, the less access people have to them, and you reach a point where people can't survive on the land they have access to as peasants, because they've been deprived of the artificial, their temporary abundance of the commons, that now having gone away, they can't survive. So they're forced into the cities. And so you get all of these people showing up who need some way to make a living, and they end up in the factories. You think about London in Dickens' time, so all those people were once peasants, and now they're forced into factory life. And so that commodification of the commons is what he's talking about, creates this paradox of wealth, that somebody got rich because now they own that part of the commons, but everybody else got poor and was forced into the city to go to work.
The first negation of capitalism. Primitive accumulation.
Okay, so this is the one I was warning you about with Hegel, and this is Hegel's dialectic. That most famously people know it as thesis, synthesis, antithesis. Hegel's more common terminology is negation of the negation, and here he's forgot that he's did this for an English-speaking audience, and he's using the German. So the der there means of negation of the negation. But so it's just that idea, things produce contradictions to themselves. And so Marxism sees capitalism itself in this process of negation, but each step of progress is a negation of the step before it. That's what he's going to try to explain.
Is the beginning of this creation of artificial scarcity for the sake of increasing private riches. And Marx quite consistently argues that the second negation, negation de negation, as the rehabilitation of the earth as commons. He says, but the capitalist production begets its own negation. This is the negation of the negation. It does not re-establish private property, but it does indeed establish individual property on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era, namely cooperation and the possession in common of the earth, the erde, and the means of production produced by labor itself. So Marx is quite eco-socialist here, right? The earth, the erde, doesn't belong to anyone. It must be common. And when I read this, I realized how ecological Marx could be, and I started doing research in his notebooks, and I realized more and more how his ecological issues was actually much deeper than other people previously assumed. And I showed this by editing the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, but I'm not going into detail of this, but anyway, Marx clearly regarded the rehabilitation of sustainable production as the central task of socialism. That's why I call his socialism as eco-socialism.
Why does every outdoor brand think I want to look like this? I know I don't. Here today is...
And this is the view that Marx already developed in Capital, Volume 1, for example, in this passage here. But the problem is that there are some passages that seem kind of contradictory. And the one passage is this one in Critique the Gotha Program, written in 1871, so after Capital.
Okay, so Gotha Program, Gotha was the name of a city, and Gotha Program was a social democratic plan for organizing things. So Marx was criticizing it because it's not radical enough.
So here he seems quite Promethean. He says, in this famous passage, in a higher phase of communist society, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round human development and all the spring of commonwealth, the genossenschaftliche Reichtum, flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety and society inscribed on its banners, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. So,
okay, narrow horizon of bourgeois right. What he's referring to there is property rights, so the right to own productive property. And here, just matter of terminology, right? For Marx, private property means things that are economically active but owned by private individuals. So factories, businesses, fleets of trucks, pipelines. I mean, so things that can be economically active. If you buy it for personal use, like your toothbrush or your own car, that's personal property. So it's it was in the economy and now it's gone. It's taken out of it because you've acquired it for personal use. Where private property is necessarily part of economic activity because it's the property that's doing the economic activity. So here he just means private ownership of that productive property.
Oh, he's saying about how the wealth flow more abundantly and then people can consume a lot. And that's why people like Herman Daly, the famous economist of the steady state economy, criticized this passage. He says, how Marx is about determinist and economic growth is always crucial in order to have abundance, etc. But it doesn't make sense, right? Because if Marx was already ecological in Capital, Volume 1, written in 1867, why was he so naive in 1871? And I think one important hint is this expression, the abundance of genossenschaftlicher Reichtum. So it's not about abundance of private wealth. He says we need to overcome the narrow horizon of bourgeois right. If we want to have the abundance of material wealth, if we want to have more and more of what we as individuals can consume, we are still trapped in the narrow bourgeois horizon. But we need to overcome this. This is what he says. And then we have the true abundance of wealth as genossenschaftlicher Reichtum, the common wealth. And this is very interesting, actually. If you read in this way, Marx is basically talking about, in a consistent from this negation, der Negation, rehabilitating the commonwealth, and that's the foundation of the abundant society. The post-scarcity society is about rehabilitating this abundance of genossenschaftlicher Reichtum.
One of the great challenges in this book is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right.
Not
So right, so what he's getting at is that it's abundance can't rationally mean everyone lives in a consumer society where they just buy endless streams of crap that they throw away the next month. So there has to be more to life than just buying crap. So abundance, that the argument here is making is Marx has to mean something else when he's using the word abundance, and he's not referring to that. But people have too often thought, well, that we measure our economic success in part by the amount of crap people can buy. And so as long as that's our measure, we're caught in a little bit of a problem, because that's just going to destroy the planet. And it may have made a little more sense before we were too aware of, or at least most people were aware of those limits. But his point, of course, is Marx was aware of those limits because he was reading people who were talking about these natural limits that were gonna challenge in that time period, challenge European society as he knew it. So something else must be going on in Marx's own thinking, and this is the part of what Saito's up to that's controversial, is because he's looking back at these details that other people haven't really looked at to say, I think we've misunderstood what Marx was trying to teach us. And so a lot of people are reacting to that and going, what do you mean misunderstood? We're studying the guy for 150 years. How is it possibly misunderstood him? Well, if you didn't read everything the guy was writing, of course it's possible to misunderstand him. And so I think that I find the argument very compelling on those grounds. But just so you all know, that's intellectually controversial still.
Consumptionist material goods. So I want to say that abundance of the genossenschaftlicher Reichtum is not equivalent to the unlimited access to abundant goods. Otherwise, communist society would simply repeat the same form of private riches as capitalism. Since primitive accumulation created artificial scarcity, communism reverses the order with the aim of recovering the radical abundance of the commonwealth making it equally accessible to everyone at the cost of private wealth. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to my conclusion. Is basically, so capitalism, the Marx eco-socialism, is characterized in the following way. It is based on Marx's insight or conviction that capitalism is a system with perpetual scarcity due to its drive for unlimited capital accumulation. It can never end. It needs more and more. It creates abundance, but it's always characterized by scarcity. So they want more. That's how we are now facing in this climate crisis. And against this unlimited growth, Marx was basically arguing for rehabilitating the abundance of commonwealth, abundance of wealth through commonification. That's the Genossenschaftliche in that passage of critique of Gotha program. And increasing commons and reducing work time and increasing time for non-consumptionist activities such as art, sports, sex, or caring, whatsoever, as well as decreasing the environmental damage can be quite central to Marx's own eco-socialism. That's my point. Of course, eco-socialism can simply say so, but also Marx's own view is quite compatible with this. And although Kate Soper in her recent book criticized Marxism, but I think what she suggests as alternative hedonism is quite compatible with my own reading of Marx's text. And this is really the new culture of, this is a topic of our section. So the system is changing and the new culture emerges, or the transformation of the system must be accompanied by the creation of new values, the new culture, because otherwise we end up with producing more and more. And that's why I want to highlight that eco-socialism without growth, this is what Kali said, is quite compatible with Marx's own vision of post-scarcity societies. And it is precisely a radical alternative to capitalist abundance in the age of climate crisis. Thank you so much.
Uh-oh. Make that stop. Okay. Oh, ooh. Okay. Now, how do I? Oh my goodness. Unshare because I'm. Oh, there it is. You made it little for me. Okay. So the important bit here, right, is we could think about making progress in the ways that are called social democracy, like the Scandinavian countries. But his point is that, yeah, I mean, you can do things that will ameliorate problems, especially problems for poor people, by taxing rich people more and sharing a little more of the wealth with them. But if the structure of society is still this capitalist structure based on consumption and this mass exploitation of natural resources, then we haven't moved at all on that environmental problem, because the society's still going to be in that trap of consumption. So for progress to be meaningful, it has to be more radical a change, such that we come to measure what we mean by economic flourishing in a different way. And it doesn't mean the ability to buy endless streams of crap. It must mean something else. And that's where he points at leisure and caring as different ways of measuring what it is that we're going to achieve by having a transformation in society. Now, there's a little more evidence that he could, I haven't encountered him drawing on, but there's a piece that Marx wrote, now I'm forgetting where it was. It might have actually been in the Gotha program. But anyway, where he talks about because Marx doesn't talk much about what he thinks socialism really means. Marx is much more a critic of capitalism than he is a theorist of socialism. But there's a famous passage where he talks about a socialist society offering people a lifestyle in which they're not trapped in a strict division of labor. And he uses this phrase of farming in the morning and raising cattle in the afternoon and doing criticism in the evening, by which he really means philosophy. Such that people aren't identified either as a critic or as a farmer or as a rancher, that they can do all of these things. So that in that little reference, he's not talking about buying stuff. He's not talking about commodities in there. He's talking about lifestyle. What is it that people are doing with their time? So I think that's actually a good reference that Saito could use more. That Marx has these other places where the hints he offers us are really about lifestyle. They're not about consumption as the measure. Okay. Questions on any of that before we go on?
We really are stuck in the consumption mode.
Yes.
Yes.
And we see people who don't care about things as lazy, or, I mean, we actually criticize people who shun materialism.
Yeah, so when you said that, I was sort of thinking about hippie communes in the 60s and 70s, and what they're doing is getting out of a consumerist lifestyle, and that just seemed really silly to people. Like, what do you mean you're going to get out of a consumerist lifestyle? Huh? But that was actually a really good insight. There's more stability in that lifestyle.
I have a daughter who does that.
Mm.
Yeah, sorry. You go ahead.
I wondered, I don't really understand about private versus public. I mean, in communism, you do have your own toothbrush, right? That's not what it means by
That's personal property, right?
yeah. Because my mother's definition of communism was, well, that anyone can just come in and steal your underwear.
Yeah. It's not quite what it means. No.
Kind of off topic of Marx, but I'm curious more about the history of the abandonment of the commons and the enclosure laws. And
Don't do that.
I'd welcome any reading you might recommend. I just read a really interesting book called The Gardens Against Time, and it sort of was a contemporary author. She's a British nature writer, art writer. But it just really brought up, all the way back to John Ball of the 14th century, who sort of espoused some of the philosophy that ended up being the levelers and the diggers movement. And it just seems like the abandonment of the commons is really the beginning of the end. Is it? You alluded to that.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
I'm curious about that whole, historic.
Yeah,
process.
and it was there's controversy at the time, and there's lots of arguments about it, and it's actually John Locke, in the way that he defends private property, is one of the big theorists. Locke wrote in the late 1700s, sort of around the time of our revolution. But that's what he's defending, actually, is those enclosures with the arguments that he's making.
But the population has increased immensely since then, and that makes it also more problematic. Even though they say we are not making more people now at the moment, but because we have, rights to birth control and that thing.
Yeah.
But did he think anything about the population control that made, or population that made a difference, a great difference?
Yeah, in his time, the issue is those things about farming and think about Malthus and sort of called Malthusianism, and so Marx is sympathetic with the premises of what Malthus was saying, right? Which goes back to that chemist that Saito was talking about, who was about looking into how soil degradation worked. And so, the sciences are telling them something's not working here, that the soils we can't keep relying on what we have to do what it's doing, that it's degrading. So if we're going to get less food from any given amount of land over time, and the population's growing, those two things that's a bad combination. And that's where Malthus comes in and says, okay, that's a disaster and we need to act to prevent that disaster. But the problem, but then I guess the next step is, how are you solving this problem? And the answer that Malthus himself comes up with, because Malthus was personally very much an elitist, so it's really about how are we going to protect elite interests and put the problem on the backs of the poor. So where Marx is coming and saying, okay, yes, this could be a problem, but it needs to be a problem that's shared by all and managed democratically, not something in which poor people are told to do this or that to solve the problem one way or another. Because one of the things that happened, right, is there were programs where people are sterilized against their will, or even sometimes without really even their knowledge. So it's that problem of kind of dictatorial control that becomes the bigger issue for progressives who are looking at population problems. But there can be agreement on both sides that there is a population problem that needs to be managed. Which is a little different. I mean, what you were pointing out about not having enough babies is about the growth problem capitalism has. That if the population isn't growing sufficiently, then there aren't as many people, younger people, to support the older people. But again, one can ask, well, maybe if we organize society differently, that wouldn't be a problem. And so yeah, there's a problem, but the reactionary solution is make them have more babies, right? That's what Vice President Vance is all about. Make them have babies. But there are other ways of solving the problem, even if you agree that there's a problem to solve.
But the current, my take on the current fear of not having enough babies is racist based and elitist based.
Definitely. Right. They don't want brown people to have babies. They want white people to have babies. Yeah, because globally there really isn't a population problem, even on capitalism's terms, because there are enough people still reproducing. It's just they're reproducing in particular places and not other places, and that means people are going to have to migrate. But then, of course, racists don't like the idea of people who don't look like them migrating. So then it's like, oh, well, no, they have to get the white people to have the babies instead, and we can therefore lock out all of the brown people. Yeah, it's pretty much crazy.
I can't help but think like much ado about nothing with skin color. It just boggles my mind. It boggles my mind that people look out into the world in terms of skin color.
Well, it is useful for those in power to keep everyone else divided. And I think that's the best lesson there. And so they want to keep us divided. So the answer is to unite. Okay, we go to the next one. So this one I think is it 2 or 3? There's like a little panel in this one, and some other
very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Steffen Kühner. I'm working with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I'm very glad to see all of you here. Right. And I also say hello to everyone who's watching this on the live stream or on YouTube later on. We are
2023 is likely to be the hottest year on record. This summer we have seen heat waves.
Wait, I'm not doing the share right, am I?
Warmer than ever before. Wildfires out of control, tornadoes and extreme rainfall have caused deaths all over the world.
There we go.
That we have a huge problem is undeniable in the light of such events. The question is, what can we do about it? And here the answers differ greatly. From the tech optimists who bet on solutions that have yet to be invented, to the supporters of so-called green capitalism who wanted to believe that we can simply continue our lifestyle. To those who claim that the battle against the climate crisis is already lost and all we can still do is to prepare ourselves for its deadly consequences. In 2020, a book was published in Japan that aims to provide an answer to these questions. It argues for a Marxist-based critique of growth and explains why we need degrowth communism and what that could look like. A few weeks ago, this book we are talking about was published in German under the title Systemsturz, der Sieg der Natur über den Kapitalismus. On this occasion, the author, Kohei Saito, is with us today. Kohei Saito is a philosopher and associate professor at the University of Tokyo. He has completed his dissertation at the Humboldt University here in Berlin.
Oh, before I forget, they're going to do some questions from the audience, and there's going to be at least one woman, maybe there are two, who refers to Saito-san, which, if you know Japanese, the san is an honorific, means Mr. So just wanted to point out, if you hear Saito-san, she's just saying Mr. Saito to be very polite.
Berlin, and he was also a co-editor of the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe. Mr. Saito, I'm very pleased to welcome you here at Rosa Luxemburg Foundation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And Rosa Luxemburg, do you guys know who Rosa Luxemburg was?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh,
a communist.
Yeah.
And she went to Russia.
Yeah, it was deported.
Yes, she was deported.
To Russia.
Yeah.
It was the Soviet Union at one point, and wasn't happy with that, with how what the Stalinists were up to. But Rosa Luxemburg, sort of very important theorist in the Marxist tradition, and so there's this institute then named after her.
I'm really happy to come back here, and it's a little awkward to speak in English because even though I got my PhD in Germany, but yes, during the pandemic, I also kind of lost my German skills. So please forgive me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight.
I mean, we talked before, and I think your German is actually excellent, but your English is as well, so that's fine. So today, Kohei Saito will explain his idea to us and put them up for discussion, and we can debate together what we can take away from them. For the climate movement, for reading Marx, for the question of what kind of transformation do we actually need and how we can achieve it. So I also welcome all of you here. I'm also very happy that you came here today. My name is Marlene Gürgen. I'm a journalist at the Taz, and I'd rather say straight away, I might have read Marx, but only a bit, and that's many years ago. So if there are people among you who are not Marx experts, don't worry. I'm not one either, and I'm moderating this event. So we will first talk here on the podium for roughly an hour, maybe a little bit less, and then there will be enough time for your questions from the audience. And after this, there will also be drinks and snacks. So if you want to, you can stay and continue the discussion over a drink. Okay, so Mr. Saito, before we talk about your book, I would like to start with your background. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself. What were your connections to the degrowth movements on the one hand and to Marxism on the other hand, and how did you come to this idea of degrowth communism?
Okay, so I mean, again, I'm Kohei Saito. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very impressed. There's so many people coming to this event, and the people asking me like, "Are you Japanese celebrity?" and so on. And it's true that there's a documentary camera backstage from Japan to actually film my trip in Europe this time, but they're also filming the 6 months of my life to broadcast it on TV. So it's something very weird is happening. The Marxists on TV and the news and the radio, and then I'm talking about degrowth communism. And this is actually the Japanese version. It reached 500,000 copies, and this is just unbelievable number. But there are reasons that which we will discuss later. But I was not
Here, it's just worth noting the he doesn't talk about it. I have not encountered him talking about this yet, but there is an existent communist party in Japan that has an actual presence in parliament. It's not big, but they do challenge, stand for elections, and there are. I looked it up once. There are a couple dozen people in national politics, and there are a few hundred in state politics, and then a few thousand in local politics, communists involved in elected posts in different levels of government. So it's even though it's small, there still is this communist party that actually is part of a small part of the government. So it's not entirely surprising that a Marxist thinker would get more attention in Japan than a Marxist thinker would get in other places in the world, given the fact that the Japanese still have this lingering communist tradition.
Degrowth kind of people from the beginning. Let me briefly tell you about my life. I entered the University of Tokyo 2005. That was a time I started reading Marx because 2005, before the economic crisis, 2008 was also the time when there was also in Japan economic inequality and the worsening of the working conditions. So I started reading the rather classical texts like Communist Manifesto and that kind of things in order to understand today's crisis of capitalism. But then I wanted to study more seriously, so I went to the U.S. But then U.S. Was non-Marxist, non-socialist, so I was like really disappointed. And I decided one day, oh, I have to go to Germany because Marx is born in Germany, right? And then in 2010, I came to Freie Universität. And then I got so disappointed. There was like no Marxist professor there. Not no, but there are not many Marxist professors anymore. But happily, I worked with Andreas Arndt. And after that, I also got involved in people like Ingo Stützle reading Capital every Monday at the over there Franz Marienplatz, and that was very interesting because there were a lot of actually interest and discussion going on outside universities, and this is something that I didn't see in Japan. Is Marxists are more academia centered. So actually, I was very much influenced by discussing issues with you drinking maybe wine and so on. But then, of course, 2011, the Fukushima nuclear power disaster came. And then I was really shocked. Of course, my relatives were living in northern part of Japan. I was worried. And then realized, how would Marxists would respond to that kind of question? Because I was also kind of more traditional, in a sense, optimistic about development of technologies and so on, but the nuclear power disaster really showed that this is not something sustainable. So then I started to question the relationship between human nature, technology, and that was a time when I also started to join in this group of Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe. That is a Japanese group, and I joined there first. And then also in the BBAB there, reading those notebooks, and I realized that Marx, especially after 60s, read many books on natural sciences. That was a time when I sort of tried to rethink about this issue of technology based on those notebooks, because Marx actually talks about how modern capitalist agriculture is robbing the soil of its nutrients, and the soil exhaustion was a problem.
Here it occurs to me maybe to make sure that you're all tracking what he means by notebooks. Because think about, like, sort of, for example, if you sort of look at what happens to a book that I'm reading, there's all these marks in it, and I leave little notes in here, but that's because I live in this consumerist world in which books are more common. So the book is my book. It's not a library book. So a lot of the books Marx is reading are library books. So he can't do that. So he has to have an actual notebook in which when he reads something in the book that is interesting, he then has to write it down, quote the book, and then he can leave himself comments about what he was just writing down from the book. So it's the collection of all of his note taking from what he was reading. That's what he's referring to when he says notebooks. So it's not like stuff Marx was writing out himself in any kind of coherent way. That's why it's hints that he was thinking this at this time and that at that time, because we know when he read that and we know when he read this, and it's in the notebooks that he said this, but it's all very sort of unorganized that way. And that's what notebooks are.
And the development of technology only reinforces that destructive tendency and so on. And that was my dissertation, Natur gegen Kapital. And then still I was...
Natur gegen Kapital. Gegen means against. So it's nature against capitalism.
More or less optimistic about technology. And the project that I started was modified, however, because 2018, 2019, there were massive uprising of like Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and I was exposed to their messages, and then I realized, okay, we need something more radical. It's not just simply investing in renewable energies and the more green technologies is not enough as long as this capitalist system of infinite accumulation and infinite growth remains. And so that was a time for me, it's a radical break, accepting, it was hard for me too, to accept that kind of degrowth. I never said explicitly in my first book, for example, degrowth, only eco-socialism. But after those movements, I realized maybe degrowth is something that we have to take into more seriously. But then, how is it actually compatible with Marx again? And so I worked on notebooks again and so on. And this is one of the more popularized version of my work, reinterpreting late Marx radically in a different manner. Namely, he became a degrowth communist.
Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, we see the result of this journey.
I see the skepticism.
As you mentioned, your book was an enormous success in Japan with over 500,000 copies sold. So yeah, what was going on there? Maybe you can explain us a little, because I was thinking like, is eco-socialism thriving in Japan and we should all move there as soon as possible, or what's going on there?
But I see also that some revivals of eco-socialist ideas in Germany too, and I was rather influenced by those, as I said, movements emerging in Europe and America. But I started writing this book in 2019, and then soon the pandemic came. So I think this success has to do with the pandemic, because during the pandemic, two things occurred. One is the economic inequality became really apparent, especially the working conditions of essential workers was so bad in Japan as well. And because of austerity and the healthcare system was in crisis, the crisis of care and so on. So we had also this book popularity of bullshit jobs and that kind of critique of someone who is just making easy money, and while many actually poor, less earning money are doing more essential jobs and so on. And then my book came in and to criticize this is really the tendency of capitalism to marginalize the cares and the essential works and so on. So that's one reason. And the second reason is I think during the pandemic, it really, our life really slowed down. Because of lockdowns and other measures. And that created some space of reflection for the Japanese people. I mean, in Japan, people work so hard. It's not like Berlin. So they never have a chance to reflect on what they're doing. They just consume, work, and then consume. And this process simply depoliticized our life and our imagination. But this situation changed. People started to spend more time with family, or maybe they started reading newspapers. And then they questioned, why did I commune 2 hours every morning? Or why did I buy so many clothes? Why did I drink so many beer with the colleagues that I don't even like, and so on? And this really created some of the contradictions became more clear. And so I think the message of degrowing, a little bit slowing down and focusing on what is more necessary, because capitalism is a system that invests in what is profitable, not what is necessary, right? So this rather created this kind of problem in the middle of pandemic. So I demanded, we have to invest in what is necessary, but this is not something that capitalism is good at doing. So this kind of message became very popular. And then maybe final one more thing is, in Japan, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of UN, is very, very popular. And then I start my book with the SDGs is the opium of the masses. Like Marx says, religion is opium masses. So because just using PET bottle, recycling things, using my bottles and eco bags, don't change basically anything about this crisis, right? But people are simply satisfied, and every newspaper, TV are praising these SDGs like the best concept ever. And then I criticize, and this got really a lot of criticism and attention, and it created a kind of the popularity at the beginning.
Sometimes criticism is also good for popularity. Yeah, that's.
Okay, so that actually is an important point that we'll come back to in the next couple of weeks, a couple of times. That, oh nuts, now I forget how I wanted to phrase it. Oh no. I'm sorry, I just had a little brain fart there, lost track of myself. I'll have to come back to it. Anybody else have a question while I'm paused? Maybe it'll give me time to remember. Oh, nuts. Okay.
Still interesting, I think, how people come from, I should rethink about drinking beer with my colleagues, to reading an explicitly Marxist argumentation, but it's nice. So.
Oh no! It was the irony of the lockdowns. That before COVID, someone could have described this happening. I mean, we've had pandemics in the past, so it's someone who's a good writer could obviously create a story that had that in. But it's curious, they probably wouldn't have thought that one of the consequences would be people discovering the idea of degrowth communism. It's like, huh. You force people, the fact of a virus forcing everyone to slow down, and now that they've slowed down, they start noticing things. And one of them is, oh, maybe I don't need as much crap. And maybe commuting 2 hours 4 hours, let's say in the morning, that'd be 4 hours a day, is utterly senseless use of my time. There's maybe more important things I can do with my time. So that's part of what dialectics, I think, points to, is the openness of the future, is that you can have a sense that something's possible, but often what people will react to, how they'll react to that thing, can be very surprising. And sometimes inspiring.
In your book, you outline 4 possible alternatives for our future. So there is climate fascism, in which the super rich use all their power to defend their privileges. Then there is climate Maoism, in which a dictatorship implements climate protection measures from above. Then there is the worst option, barbarism, in which basically everybody is at war with everybody else. And then against these 3 options, you put degrowth communism as the only desirable way. So can you briefly characterize what is this alternative about?
Okay, so degrowth communism is a kind of political intervention. I think today we need to have an idea of post-capitalism. That was my project. And that was why I think we still have to read Marx. Marx doesn't give an answer about concrete visions of society, future society, but still he really allows us to imagine to something beyond capitalism. So I utilized the climate crisis as a kind of the intervention, the opportunity of political intervention to radicalize some of the content among various discussions of the left. The problem of the traditional communist or socialist labor movement is obviously they are still sometimes quite productivist. They are praising more technological progress, and they also focus more on social welfare and higher wage and that kind of issue more than climate issues. So this marginalization is obviously not good because as the climate crisis deepens, we have less and less space for that kind of the more socialist movement either. Now, I think one of the things that we need to learn from degrowth people is that growth after a certain point is not desirable, neither environmentally sustainable. So today, especially in the countries like Global North, we already have reached to a point where the further growth doesn't necessarily make us happier, or it doesn't bring the new technology that really saves us from the climate crisis. So eco-socialism, the idea of eco-socialism, people like John Bellamy Foster, Michel Levy, those people discussed this eco-socialism for many years, and I was greatly inspired. But it's not enough today because eco-socialism can be growth-driven. It can aim to grow more once capitalist model production is overcome. But the point of degrowth is, as I said, after a certain point, no matter what kind of model production you have, growth is no longer sustainable because, as Marx says, the Stoffwechsel, the metabolism between humans and nature, are some process of trans-historical process of exchange of energy, resources, and those things. So this is a material process that you can simply overcome in socialism. We are always conditioned. And in that sense, we need to a little bit specify the idea of eco-socialism, which I put forward and defended in Natur gegen Kapital. I realized I need to go one more step further. It's either eco-socialist degrowth or degrowth communism. And I use the term degrowth communism for some reason, maybe I may explain later. But also, my point is, we also need communism or socialism, some kind of society beyond capitalism. Because I'm aware that many people also in Germany, like Meyer Gepel or Ulrich Hellmann, they also talk about endless capitalism and then they, excessive consumption and great inequalities and et cetera, problematic. But then in the end, their proposals are like a little bit more progressive tax and a little bit of slowing down of certain bad industries. But we can have private properties, we can have market, competition, price mechanism. So after all those critiques and talking about crisis of capitalism, basically capitalism remains. And then I wonder if that's really enough. Because what we are witnessing today is even after the discussions on Green New Deal, in Green Deal, and all the kind of things, we haven't witnessed sufficient progress. So I think there's something fundamentally contradictory about capitalism and environment. So my idea is communism or socialism are very important today. And degrowth people or someone who criticize the excessive kind of growth, they don't necessarily talk about socialism. So it's my political intervention. Degrowth side need to learn more from the socialist tradition because we need to plan more, we need to produce what is more necessary than what is profitable. So degrowth people have this learning process, but at the same time, socialists, communist side, the labor movement have to learn from the degrowth side about the criticism of productivism. So this idea of degrowth communism is first, this kind of a combination, the necessity of both sides, environmentalism and the labor movement need to learn each other. And then they need to make an alliance. And only then it is today possible to really fundamentally challenge the fossil capital and other forms of domination and injustice under capitalism.
Okay, and I also wanted to mention too his comment about the recycling our plastic bottles and reusing bottles and taking our bags with us to the grocery store. and also things like electric cars. That what he's getting at is an important part of this, that we're often told that we should be aware of our own carbon footprint as individuals and we should try to reduce it. But the scale of the problem is really beyond individual actions like that. And even if everybody all of a sudden started behaving the way that they're supposed to in those sort of environmentally friendly ways, we wouldn't even be close to starting to solve the problem, because the problem is the structure of how the society is organized to produce things. And so because when it's organized around individual consumption, then you're always going to have this impulse to produce stuff that's profitable, that people can buy. And if you don't change or revolutionize, somehow undermine this structure that's putting everything onto individual decision making, and recognize it needs to be large scale, how entire industries are organized, how entire cities are organized, and transportation systems, that it like for us, it doesn't work to switch everyone to electric cars, because that's still too carbon intensive in the process of producing all of those individual cars. What we need is actually mass transit. But to do that, you have to rethink the way American cities are laid out, because American cities were all laid out to accommodate individual cars. So we have a hard time thinking about how to tackle the problem on that scale. And so it can be a little reassuring when people are putting out the message, well, you can do something by changing your individual consumption. So that's what he's saying by the opium of the masses there, is that it's making people feel like they're doing something, but even though it is something, it's just such a tiny, tiny something as to be insignificant. And it's distracting people from what they really need to be doing, which is to organize to figure out a way of changing the whole structure of how things are produced and what's produced and how the decisions are made to produce what, which is that bit about producing for need instead of producing for profit. Okay. Is that clear? Okay.
Okay, thank you. So I think we got an idea now what is the difference between your degrowth approach and liberal degrowth ideas, I would say. And this is precisely that you speak about capitalism as the core of it, and others don't. So maybe we can now talk a bit more about how degrowth communism relates to classical Marxist argumentation, because many Marxists would argue that according to Marx, communism and the liberation of the working class can only be achieved through an increase in productive forces, and then every degrowth approach would stand in contradiction to the interests of the working class. But you argue that Marx, especially in his late work, I think, came to a different conclusion or had a different view. And yeah, maybe you can elaborate a bit on that.
Okay. I simplified a little bit for the clarity. But basically, I define capitalism as a society where the logic of capital is most dominant thing. That is why we have capitalism. And what is capital? Capital is a constant movement of Geld, Ware, Geld.
Geld means money in German.
General formula of constant increase of value. So capitalism is fundamentally defined by the constant economic growth. That's the system. But the problem is our interaction, which Marx calls metabolism, is something that is independent of capital. They exist for many years. Even before capitalism, we always had this kind of Stoffwechsel mit Natur. The problem is this process cannot be so easily modified. But capital increases its productivity with new technology, and they try to accelerate the circuit of capital so that they can invest and more, and the profit will be increased. The problem is when this process of acceleration, expansion of capital reaches a certain point, it creates the conflict or tension with the universal metabolism of nature. And that is where the
And tension, that's what he's earlier was calling rift, the metabolic rift.
metabolic rift,
Oh,
it's a kind of disruption occurs between metabolism of society and the metabolism of nature. And this is what Marx actually criticizes in the volume 3 of Capital. The problem is still, even despite this kind of criticism, I think this is a basic of ecological critique for Marxists. And then the problem is still many traditional Marxists had this kind of view of historical materialism, which is the mode of capitalist production consists of forces of production and the relations of production. And in a similar way, the productive forces reach a certain point, it creates some kind of tension, and it explodes the mode of capitalist mode of production, and then it reaches to next mode of production. So this kind of argument, of course, it's very simplified, but this kind of argument is often implicit in various forms of historical materialism. And this becomes a very easily productivist. Okay, so what we need first productive forces, and then there will be a contradiction with the relations of production and so on. That was also the view, more or less, Marx put forward, especially in his writing about India, for example, British colonialism. And he basically saw that bringing this kind of technological development in other kind of societies is also necessary, but also the more increase of technology to productive forces necessary for Western countries and so on. But I don't think this is acceptable today, because also Marx started to correct this view. Why? Because, as I said, capitalism develops technology, increase productive forces, but only for the sake of making more profit, exploiting more from workers, or taking out, extracting resources and energies from nature. So these are the technologies that actually oppress workers, take away the freedom and autonomy of workers. These are the technology that actually creates various kinds of environmental destruction. So how would it be possible to use this kind of development of productive forces in order to emancipate workers and to fix the metabolic rift? Rather, precisely this development of technology is creating this metabolic rift, and it is also undermining the working condition of workers. So all these kind of things happen.
So this is the basic point the Luddites were making. You know, we tend culturally to think of Luddites as just being anti-technology, but it's actually a workers' movement, and it's not the technology that bothered them, it's the way the technology was used. And so I think I mentioned that when the first week, this idea, right? If you have some new technology comes in that allows you to double the productivity of the factory, what is the capitalist response? Fire half the workers. What is the socialist response? Cut the workers' workday all in half. You know, so it's not, even for the Luddites, it's not that technology is inherently problematic. It's always about how the technology is being used. That's the question. And is that going to be problematic or not? So I just thought it was an important point to weave that in.
Happens. He started reading Justus von Liebig, and this was, I argue in my book, that was a moment when he started to question this kind of optimistic assumption. And what happens afterwards? He was in a sort of personal crisis because he was defending this historical materialism for many, many years. But then this becomes incompatible with his ecological critique of capitalism. So what happens after publication of volume 1, after 1868, he started to reading more and more of natural sciences. And if you read these notebooks that are now available in the Marx and Engels Gesamtausgabe, they contain a lot of ecological insights about deforestation, exhaustion of soil, coal, and also extinction of species, and that kind of issues are already there. And he was paying attention how the development of capitalism and technologies create that kind of problems. Interestingly, this is one of the arguments in my book. He also studied pre-capitalist and non-Western societies at the same time with natural sciences. That was very weird because he was actually supposed to complete volume 2 and 3 of Capital. Engels was pushing, asking, when do you finish it? But then he's reading books of natural science, and then pre-capitalist society, communes in Russia, India, and then so on and so on. Why? I think here again, the theory of metabolism is very important because Marx was studying different ways of organizing metabolic interaction between humans and nature in other societies, other ways. And these are existent at the time in Russia, in Asia, in Latin America. So he was reading about them, but it was existing already in the past too, right? So he was reading about Germanic communities and other kinds of communities too. And then he realizes these societies are actually quite persistent. That expression comes from Morgan, but the persistent means.
Morgan's actually an interesting character. Important, like, was contemporary of Marx's, and was famous for studies he did of tribal cultures, especially of the Iroquois. And so Marx and Engels both found Morgan's work very fascinating because he's describing this society that's very egalitarian, and the Iroquois even had a lot of gender equality in it. And you know, so here's this example of a society that socially seems much more advanced because of how it treats people compared to the technologically advanced societies that they're living in Europe. So that, I think what Saito's getting at is that those ideas are starting to be disruptive in their thinking, especially Marx's thinking about what he had said before, that maybe there's something here that we need to work on preserving this old thing rather than letting capitalism trample it just so we can get to something new, which would be the traditional way of reading what he was saying in terms of his historical materialism.
Richard?
Yeah.
I can't help but think almost a dichotomy of humans and nature, just saying those words separates us from nature.
Right.
And of course, my personal bias would point to especially Christian religion, which sort of put us apart from animals and thus nature.
Yeah. No, there's historically there's a lot of connection to that. That idea of especially soul being something very different.
Right. And animals don't have that. So
yeah. And Judaism doesn't have that idea of soul the way Christianity has it. So it introduced, you get the possibility intellectually of this division once you have those kinds of ideas. Yeah. Rather than just a relationship.
I knew somebody, he was like 60 years old and had just discovered that we are animals and was shocked that I had that concept since high school.
Huh.
And he was deeply religious, happened to be deeply religious, but it was an epiphany for him at 60 years old.
Huh. Wow. I guess better late than never.
And when we do separate ourselves from nature, then it becomes easier to take advantage and not care for it.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah. And that's sort of the importance that he's making out of what's our vision of ourselves, our vision of the future. What can we imagine as possibilities, and freeing our imagination that way. Okay, got about 10 minutes left. Do a couple more minutes.
Very stable. It doesn't change, but it also means, in a different way, sustainable. It reproduces its basic condition. So it doesn't increase productive forces, but everyone is kind of equal. And then the society itself is persistent, so meaning sustainable. So he realizes in other societies, this problem of equality and sustainability under the persistency of the society, this is related to each other. The problem of equality and sustainability is related. That is why he was so.
Well, and here, even just sort of as a matter of logic, right? Because Marx is working with this idea from the manifesto that history is driven by class struggle. Well, looking at a society that doesn't seem to actually have classes, let alone classes that could struggle against each other, well, then there isn't a history to be driven by class struggle. There's something else which is now persistent instead of changing because of that class struggle. And that, I mean, in 1848, that's what they called primitive communism in the manifesto. And because that just seemed obviously to be something that changes and goes away, well, then that just became part of their thinking in 1848. Okay, there's this process and those old ways go away, but we're going to find a way to return to the equality that they had. And then what Saito's getting at is later on, Marx is sort of reading more and more about the world and learning more about the world outside of Europe. And it's like, oh, he has this realization, maybe there are still societies that have managed to persist and provide really good examples of how this relationship is ongoing and didn't actually end everywhere, and therefore this pattern isn't perhaps going to hold all over the world the way they were thinking at first it would. So I think there is an inherent logic in how Marx is going from one step to another to arrive at that conclusion.
So excited about Russian communes. And then in his very last stage of his life, Russian revolutionary Vera Gasulich asks the question, capitalism is coming to Russia, would it be necessary for Russian communes to get destroyed by the power of capital? And then comes the socialist revolution. And then Marx says, no, what I talked about only applies to the Western societies. But then he continues. Even the Western societies are now facing the crisis of capitalism. And then the solution for this crisis is to return to a higher form of archaic commune.
Higher form of archaic commune is what he was saying. So it's, again, in that Hegelian logic, negation of the negation, that's how you can go, you have this, that archaic commune encounters contradictions with the world and history, but then history and the world move on such that we notice a different contradiction that brings us back to looking at that archaic way of life and saying, oh, okay, we need to learn from that too, rather than just leave it behind.
And he says, now returning to commune life, but of course in higher form. Why? Because he was realized that kind of the equality and sustainability are closely related, and that these kind of conditions were satisfied under those communes. So he learned, he was inspired. So he even says Western society needs to learn from those communes, and they have to internalize some of the principles. What is the principle? Social equality, as I said, communality, and then sustainability under the persistency of the economic system, which is basically steady state. This is why those communes have been there for many, many years, hundreds, but thousands of years. Marx despised this in the 50s. This invariability of these communes must be destroyed by British imperialism and so on. But in the 80s, he changed his evaluation completely. And I think he sort of accepted, he corrected his productivism, he corrected his Eurocentrism, and then he abandoned this earlier form of historical materialism. Everything sort of changed. And then I think he became more open to the idea of steady state economy for the sake of establishing communism, which I call degrowth communism.
Okay. So there's another sort of internal logic that Marx is, I think, I think, sort of following implicitly, which goes back to some earlier work where he's talking about the difference between town and country. And it's, I mean, it's, you know, we're noticing some of that in our politics, right? That country is reactionary and Republican, and city is cosmopolitan and liberal. And there's this tension between those things. And Marx was already aware of those kinds of tensions, even in his period of time, those things had started to develop. But there also is different kinds of tensions in that, you know, the cultural centers are in the cities. And so the countryside ends up kind of culturally deprived, because anyone who's doing anything that's really interesting and culturally ends up in the city doing it, where they get a bigger audience. And also find more people who are interested in doing those things. And wealth ends up getting concentrated in the cities. And so you have all of these tensions that exist between town and country that he knew had to be resolved if society was going to move forward. And so there are places where you get a sense that when he thinks about socialist society, one of the things he's envisioning is that we're reworking how we think about city and country, and diversifying so that we have fewer really big urban centers and much more kind of medium development across the whole country, so that everybody kind of has a little bit of access to all of these things. City people have had more access to nature. Country people have more access to culture. So that problem and then the need for some sort of democratic solution to it was already part of his thinking way back in the 1840s too. So it is also true he did at some point talk about how he thought that British imperialism was a progressive force because it was destroying this old stagnated way of life in India, especially rural India. But there is lingering in other things he said already a hint that observation is problematic, because he already knows there's this town and country problem that the British imperialism is only going to magnify. And then what I think what Saito's getting at is that once you see the actual magnification of the problem, which is resulting in this metabolic rift, as well as these cultural differences between town and country, then it really becomes obvious to Marx, that he has to rethink those, especially those ideas he had about British imperialism and how progress is going to work around the world. And that it can't all just follow this European model, this Eurocentric model that he had started with. Okay, couple minutes left. What are y'all thinking?
Difficult.
Well, when you talked about urban versus city, I mean, urban versus country, it came to mind about, my mind went right away to, oh, but cities are more efficient, which means more profitable. But if I change my mindset and say what's really necessary as opposed to what's profitable and
There you go.
efficient,
Yeah.
but you know, my brain is geared towards efficiencies.
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
always a good thing,
Right.
but I could see the necessary is a wonderful way to look at it. What's necessary?
Yeah. Are we producing what's necessary, or producing, what's profitable?
But my understanding is if you're a corporation, you are obligated by law to only think of profits and shareholder value.
Yeah, but that's a decision, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
that's true. That's true.
There are laws that structure that, and those could change. And other countries, there are examples where they do that they introduce other constraints into the system, those capitalist firms have multiple incentives to act on, instead of just the single incentive of short-term profit.
Or nonprofits are an
Or
attempt,
that,
right?
yeah, that's there. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing inherently illogical about having a nonprofit that made what would be necessary, like hospital gowns and masks. you know, that's made by for-profit corporations, but there's nothing about reality that makes it impossible to do that in a way that isn't after profit, except the world we live in, you know, the culture we're in is the problem. It's not, you know, sort of the structure of reality that's the problem. So it's a cultural, it's a thereby it's something we can change because it's cultural.
Well, I think we are also a little idealistic, because I remember that we went to New Guinea, and that is not a very developed place. And so they had, every year they have a festival, and they put potatoes in so that all the tribes come down, and then in a big field, like a soccer field, they display their wonderful dress. Or maybe all shells, you know. So we went out ourselves in the country, and we went up the hills, and then we stopped at I don't know, can't remember why or what, and we got out of the car, and then we walked, and there was a woman. She was very, very scrawny, very wrinkled, and she was nude from the top, and she suckled a pig, a little pig.
Whoa.
And that was a kind of an opening to the door of country life and what it represents in many countries.
What's necessary, right? I mean, was it necessary to feed the pig in order to eat?
Well, the way she looked, yes. That she did.
Yeah, in that, yeah. So the issue is the necessary in context, but if you could change the context.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's right. If you could change the context.
Yeah, so we definitely want to alleviate that kind of problem.
Well, I almost think that Marxism can only be implemented in rich countries now.
Well, I mean, this is sort of fundamentally the point. It's not, I mean, is is socialism only possible in those advanced countries? But is Marx maybe seeing a possibility in which that country life could reach a higher stage without having the problems of capitalist development as the solution? Because that's I mean, when you see, you know, that sort of abject poverty in the developing world that way, it does seem like clearly we need development, that there has to be development. These people need more economic development. Instead of being stuck in the trap of this, you know, kind of pastoral life. And, you know, and his degrowth argument is not that they shouldn't have development. It's more, we need to find a way to do that development responsibly while we rich people stop and cut back on our own development. So it may be that, I mean, and part of the point there is that as a global totality, the world really is developed enough in terms of its ability to produce stuff and material resources. It's just the distribution problem. You know, it's just hoarded by too few people. If we actually took that and shared it, so we're at a better place in history than Marx himself was, because he's imagining capitalism producing enough wealth to do this, where we now live in the world where capitalism has produced enough wealth to do it. And the issue now is how is that productive capacity that's already here going to relate to trying to help people who are caught in cycles of poverty somewhere else, away from the centers of that wealth.
Well, but that I don't think that everyone here is so well preserved or get rich or has a great home. I don't think that this is a very rich country, this country, not in morals or anything. I don't.
Well, but no, but the point is that we have sufficient material wealth that everybody could live
Oh, yeah.
much better.
Well, I don't know. I live,
We have
as
that
you know, I live above a dumpster, and I see many people go into the dumpster, and it doesn't
Yeah,
look that
but-
great.
because the wealth is hoarded instead of shared.
Yes.
Even
Yeah.
as far as, basic services, like the crisis in rural America of healthcare, where just the
Mhm.
mass consolidation of hospital systems, where it's near impossible, to get specialty care, sometimes even primary care. So this whole idea of the medium development, they don't mean suburban development. It's a different concept that's unfamiliar to me. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is there again, I think, Saito's emphasis on the humanities, we need visions of this, what's possible, have people have good imaginations telling stories about what's possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, instead, we have so many visions of dystopia.
Yeah. Yeah, the society is definitely feeling a little pessimistic, and we need more visions.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, like in movies and
Yeah,
video
exactly.
games and all these
Right.
things that we're bombarded with.
There's some hopeful speculative fiction writers out there. Kim Stanley Robinson is one. He's a realist, but he's also really hopeful. I mean, he has, I think he's a humanist at heart.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
All right, peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Let's see, stop.